After 42 chapters and 1,059 verses, the narrator at long last reappears, presumably to bring to an end this Job drama that's unfolded before us over the last couple of weeks. The narrator offers two judgments at this point here. We pick up the story in the final chapter in the book of Job, chapter 42. The conclusion to the story begins in verse 7. After the Lord had finished speaking to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am angry with you and your two friends, for you have not spoken accurately about me as my servant Job has. So take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer on your behalf. I will not treat you as you deserve, for you have not spoken accurately about me as my servant Job has. So Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite did as the Lord commanded them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. When Job prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes. In fact, the Lord gave him twice as much before. Then all his brothers and sisters and former friends came and feasted with him in his home. And they consoled him and comforted him because of all the trials the Lord had brought against him. And each of them brought him a gift of money and a gold ring. So the Lord blessed Job in the second half of his life, even more than in the beginning. For now he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 teams of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He also gave Job 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. He named his first daughter Jemimah, the second Keziah, and the third Keren-Happuch. In all the land no women were as lovely as the daughters of Job, and their father put them into his will along with their brothers. Job lived 140 years after that, living to see 4 generations of his children and grandchildren. Then he died an old man who had lived a long and full life. The two judgments that the narrator here brings forth is that against Job's friends, God says that they have not spoken rightly of him, and he brings judgment against them. But for Job, he says that Job has spoken what is right. But there are some questions that this affirmation brings for us this morning. Is this an affirmation of his pained acceptance of suffering as part of God's inscrutable wisdom? Or rather, is it an affirmation of Job's pained protest of suffering, which he insists is part of God's inscrutable justice? What's interesting about this point is that Job's restoration is tied to the intercession on behalf of his friends. It's when Job prays for them, then God restores him to his previous prosperity and happiness. Although this is often called the restoration of Job, I think it's worth noting that Job never really quite asked God for the restoration of anything that he had lost except for their relationship. His restoration thus is an act of grace, not a reward to a changed approach to God. God was not bound to restore Job, but God, in God's goodness and in God's freedom, God found it fitting that he restore Job to his place, his previous place, even more so. Often, some folks might read or interpret this story as God rewarding Job for Job's piety, for perhaps not wanting to curse God, forgetting all of the in-between discussions and dialogue between Job and his friends. But the viewpoint of this being a reward, I think, is incomplete and not fair to the story or the entirety of this story. This is why this moment is a moment of God's grace for Job, not a gift for Job. Now that Job has seen God, God gives him double of what he had before. He receives double the number of animals and material wealth to make him twice as wealthy as he was before. Things once again turn for the best for Job. But as we concluded last week, this story, this conclusion, this place where Job ends might create some problems, might create some tensions for some of us, for those of us who have little Jobs in our own hearts. Last week we concluded with the sobering words of Cynthia Ozick, and I want to remind you what she wrote because they were in anticipation for what was to come this week. And if we are to take the close of the tale as given, it is not only Job's protests that are stilled, it is also his inmost moral urge. What has become of raging conscience? What has become of loving kindness? Prosperity is restored. The dead children are replaced by twice the number of boys, by girls exceedingly comely. But where now is the father's bitter grief over the loss of those earlier sons and daughters on whose account he once indicted God? Cushioned again by good fortune, does Job remember nothing, feel nothing, see nothing beyond his own renewed honor? Is Job's lesson from the whirlwind finally no more than the learning of indifference? It's this challenge of indifference, of apathy, of hopelessness that we wrestle with. How is it that Job here at the end of his story, at the end of his suffering, his trials, gets more than what he had before? For some, that's troubling. Perhaps highlighted by the fact that Job's children are just seemingly and casually replaced. He receives his 10 children once again, 7 boys and 3 girls, because, maybe receiving 20 children might have been too much. Maybe that might not have been such a blessing. But he receives his 10 once again. But what about those 10 that he has lost? Is it business as usual? Has nothing quite changed for Job after all of this drama? If nothing has changed, I think the story becomes an unsettling account for piety. But here, I think there's a slight difference in the account of Job's conclusion here that I think is worth mentioning. And I think there's one clue here that business doesn't quite return to usual. The key to understanding this moment in Job's story, I think, lies in his daughters, in Job's daughters. The focus on Job's 3 daughters here in the Hebrew tradition is unusual, to say the least. Where it's typical to highlight the men in a society, to name them, here we see the author of Job naming the women. There's no real specific mention of the 7 boys, the men that Job receives. But here the 3 daughters receive special mention at this point. The author decides to focus on them for a moment and list them by name. Their names being Jemima, which means dove, Keziah, cinnamon, and Karen Hapuk, which means something like a cosmetic box or an eyeliner, black makeup. It's something that kind of beautifies the eyes. Jemima being a dove, Keziah, cinnamon, Karen Hapuk, this makeup that beautifies the eyes. What's interesting is in the symbolism, I think, that these names kind of represent. A dove meaning grace or peace in the Bible. Cinnamon, perhaps a sign of abundance. And this cosmetic makeup that beautifies the eye, that symbolizes beauty. Peace, grace, abundance, beauty. Furthermore, the narrator goes a step further in this story by reporting that Job gave the daughters an inheritance along with the sons here. Again, in the conventional world of the Bible, it was the sons that received an inheritance, not the daughters. But here, in an interesting change of events, Job decides that his daughters receive an inheritance, a blessing, being part of the will as well. So as to say that perhaps this suffering that Job experiences transforms not only his personal situation, but perhaps also his understanding of what constitutes justice and equity. This is perhaps a nod to a new sense of justice upon experiencing God. But in the end, I think the key is these daughters. They hold the hermeneutical key for the conclusion of Job's story. Jemima, peace, grace. Keziah, abundance. Karen Hapuk, beauty. I think it's these 3 names that will pave the way for the 2 final considerations that I want us to bring forward, to resurface here at the end of Job's story. At the very beginning of our series, I considered the question, is Job a theodicy? Is Job a justification of God in light of gratuitous evil and suffering? The answer to that was no. Job is not a formal theodicy, although Job struggles with the question of innocent suffering deeply. It is one of the central questions of this story. That's to say that we could ask the question, is life with all of its suffering worth living? I think one of the frustrations of the book of Job here is that the book spreads out almost a feast of interpretations and theological implications for what this innocent suffering might produce. There's a feast of theological positions that are laid out between Job and his friends, but none of them really settling on an answer that might decisively answer the question for us. The author, by undermining all the easy interpretations of Job's suffering, all of the cliche proverbs that could have been placed on Job's life, the author reminds us of our limited grasps on the truth of our theological positions. Such an unsettling position summons us to open our understanding to humility in holding our truth, and to recognize that the theologies that we create actually have to confront the real life people and their experiences. That in times of uncertainty and meaninglessness, Job calls us to a stubborn fidelity to the God who transcends all of our attempts of reducing God into rigid and narrow doctrines. However, I think if we can draw perhaps one particular thread from this story, it is that this story loudly and I think clearly denies that all suffering is the result of sin. That's something that we have to step back from. It denies that all suffering has the purpose of discipline. The cause of suffering is far too complex to be reduced to a single explanation that can be applied to every case. The book of Job serves as a warning to those who want to judge others based on the quality of their life. It's a warning that we cannot judge other people's life, the quality of their life, where they are in their life, based on those decisions. While the book of Job doesn't explain Job's suffering, and really no other text in the Bible really settles the matter for that reason, the Bible instead, here at this point on the question of suffering, provides a portrait, it provides a story. As a whole, the Bible provides a story of another one who suffers innocently and whose suffering on the cross and ultimate death on the cross culminates in the gift of new life. Job wanted to know why, and God confronted him with the I am. This leads us to perhaps the second item I want us to draw on in concluding the book of Job. And it's this question about the movement of mature faith. As the story begins for Job, Job is rich, he's secure, he's powerful, and surrounded by family and servants. Even when Satan, the accuser, removes his blessings, he remains righteous. His piety is perhaps pre-critical and unquestioning. His life has clarity of purpose. He's well accepted in his community. But as the story progresses, as we move into the poetry, Job's trust evaporates as rage, doubt, and despair displace it. The collapse of his life at this point brings his loss of tradition and all of the pillars that had supported him. Before, he was a comforter and a leader in his community. But after the breaking of his world, his theology no longer holds any of it. It can't quite support or illuminate his life or provide answers for his questions. Instead, his life at this point challenges his theology in adding pain without adding any new way of understanding what is going on. He faces what many thinkers later call the dark night of the soul, when all support for faith unravels and one plunges into divine absence. Yet, even in this process, Job remains faithful. He continues to grow in courage. He becomes bolder. His rhetoric is one of lament for all that he has lost. He voices his anger and grief to his friends and to God. His truthful, angry speeches become a vehicle of his loyalty, though. Job holds fast to his integrity despite efforts of his friends to talk him out of the experience, of his experience of the world. It's at this moment that it enables him to dare to challenge God and to demand that God step forward and explain these matters to him. Job's life, from a faith of few challenges, spirals down into this chaotic mess where doubt and faith no longer have any buttress or external support. Yet in the midst of this bitter strife, he never lets go of God. This is his journey. This is his trajectory. Instead, he yells and cries angrily at God, telling his truth and keeping their relationship alive. When Job and God finally meet, when they meet in this storm, Job learns this reorientation. He confronts a transformation. And I don't want to say conversion because I think conversion might be too weighty of a word for us here. But he knows and learns this reorientation and transformation. This new way of being that kind of exceeds his theological and philosophical backgrounds. His encounter with God, with the beauty of the divine revelation, with the cosmos, and by implication, the beauty of God's very being. It provides him with a direct spiritual experience. And he gains this sense of oneness with all that is in life. He shares life with the behemoth and the Leviathan, two creatures that we talked about last week, who are proud and joyous in expressions of divine life. It's in this storm that Job glimpses a world energized by God's creative activity, by the creative power of God. This glimpse into the sort of absolute wondrous nature of the Creator and of creation kind of reorders Job's orientation, his glimpse, his understanding of the world today and of his relationships. His life becomes more open, more inclusive, and more peaceful as he brings all of his community together once again. He repairs his friendships, interceding on their behalf before God and extending extraordinary care toward his daughters. In the storm, Job receives a life-affirming greeting from God. And however we deal with the outstanding questions in the book of Job, the many lingering questions that we are left with, the beauty of the book calls us to glimpse God's amazing creative divinity with awe and reverence. It summons us to a care for creation and all of its inhabitants, especially those who know Job's suffering and abysmal pain. it urges us toward lives of worship and gratitude. This is the entirety, the transformation of Job's faith from beginning to end. The Job drama began with an opening scene and in the heavenly courts where Satan, the accuser, came before God and God asked the accuser, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Job stands out and God asks, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Perhaps at the conclusion of this book, we who might find ourselves sitting in the heaps and ashes with Job this morning, in the midst of suffering for no reason, we hear the words of God, Jesus echo on the cross. We hear his words ring and resonate ever stronger within us. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Here at the end of Job's story, after charting the waters of innocent suffering and charting the waters of mature faith, we stand before Job at the end of his story, and we realize that we are, in a very real sense, also standing before Jesus at the end of his. In the book of Luke, chapter 24, there's a scene here where Jesus appears before his disciples. Jesus asks them, "Why are your hearts filled with doubt? Look at my hands, look at my feet. You can see that it's really me. Touch me and make sure that I am not a ghost, because ghosts don't have bodies, as you see that I do." As he spoke, he showed them with his hands and his feet. Still, they stood there in disbelief, filled with joy and wonder. And then he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it as they watched. There's an interesting dynamic that plays out here at this moment, the still moment in the book of Luke. The disciples here are frightened. They're unsure about what they're experiencing at this moment. Some are panicked, some feel doubt. Maybe some believe. There's a mix of emotions that fill this room. But after Jesus has experienced his own abandonment, his own dark night of the soul, he reemerges, he resurrects before his disciples. And what the best that he can do, the best that he calls them for, is to come and see, to feel for themselves that all of this is true. I think that leads us to question, what will we feel that compels us to do something that makes a difference in this life, not only in death? If the God who was in Jesus truly expects us to touch and feel what it means to be grieved even to death, then perhaps answering the question that launched this book at the very beginning, "Have you considered my servant Job?" is still worthy of our best efforts. To the silence that God gives to Job's incessant questioning about innocent suffering, though we may not find an answer that suits us best at this point, I think the best that the Job story can offer us, a guidance, if you will, is to come and experience God for yourself. Like Job in his stubborn fidelity to God, always calling God to come and act, to appear. There are no easy answers that can suffice, but we take a moment to look, to see, to taste, and feel who God is. It's like the stories of Job and Jesus, people who have wrestled and struggled with it, that we can find a connection point, a parallel with our own stories, where Jesus simply says, come, see, taste, feel who God is. May your faith journey be one where, like Job, you find the grace and peace of Christ, where you experience the abundance of God's goodness here on earth. And that may you be struck by the absolute wonder and beauty in God's creativity. There's the key. It's the three daughters of Job: abundance, grace, peace, and beauty. May you find that in your struggle, in your wrestling, in your faith journey with God. Amen. Good morning and happy Sabbath. Thanks for joining us online here this morning. If you're new, if you haven't joined us before, welcome. Please visit our website for more information about who we are and how we can get connected. We have services on Wednesday evening at 7:30, and we begin on Saturdays on Sabbath at 9:30 a.m. for our services. We'd love to see you and connect with you in any way possible. For those of you who are regular members and are with us on a weekly basis, welcome once again and happy Sabbath. If you look at our website, that will be the place where you can get the most updated information about where we are with the current pandemic. We don't currently have any solid plans for opening, but we are paving the way for that to happen in some near future. So stay tuned for whatever changes might come up. On our website, you'll also find ways to support our ministry through donations, tithes, offering, whatever you choose. We thank you for all that you do, for the ministries that you support, and the way that you continue to support us forward. May you have a blessed Sabbath. May you be well, and may you stay safe.